Good evening and welcome. My name is Dr. Kara Anthony. I'm a member of the Theology Department here at the University of St. Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you to our forum entitled Habemus Papam, We Have a Pope. And we'll be here tonight discussing the upcoming papal conclave and its significance. We have with us tonight three panelists, and from your left to right, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Michael Hollerich, who is a professor of theology with a specialization in church history, particularly the early church. He recently published a translation of articles by the German patristic scholar Erich Peterson under the title Theological Tractates. His next book project is a study of the reception of the writings of the 4th century church historian Eusebius of Caesarea. He will be sharing with us tonight reflections on papal elections in ancient and modern times. So from Dr. Hollerich, we'll get some of the background on papal elections. Our second speaker is Dr. Massimo Fagioli. Professor Fagioli is a church historian who spent a few years at the Vatican Secret Archive. His publications focus especially on the Second Vatican Council. His most recent book is titled Vatican II, The Battle for Meaning. Here at St. Thomas, he teaches on Vatican II and ecclesiology. And together with our third speaker, Dr. Schlabach, he teaches and will be teaching a course on global Christianity and Catholicism. Dr. Gerald Schlabach is chair of Justice and Peace Studies and professor of theology with a specialization in ethics and the global church. His most recent book is titled Unlearning Protestantism, Sustaining Christian Community in an Unstable Age. Dr. Massimo Fagioli will be speaking with us about the conclave of 2013 and its meaning. Dr. Schlabach will be speaking with us about the Roman papacy and global Christianity. So together, the three of them will be able to give us a good picture of what to expect and what the meaning of the papal conclave is. Our format tonight is that each speaker will have about 15 minutes to present, and then after that, we'll have an open question and answer time, and there will be microphones available to you on the floor to ask your questions. So without further ado, Michael Hollerich.
Thank you, Kara. I work in a subdiscipline of theology in which everybody I study is dead, and most of them dead for a very long time. I mistakenly referred to the current abdication as a death. This is, of course, a slip of the tongue, and I apologize to my colleagues and to Benedict himself, who was very much alive. I'm going to talk about papal elections in the past and in the medieval period with just a glance to the modern, and I will try and keep to the 15-minute slot. I expect my colleagues to signal me when I've gone over. Papal elections are almost the last relic of an electoral principle that was once far more common in the church. In the early Christian period, bishops were chosen by a variety of methods: election by the local clergy and the people, appointment by higher authority, both episcopal and imperial, and election by popular acclamation. But election by the local clergy, the council of presbyters or priests who assisted the bishop, and with the participation of the laity, that was the ideal. Today, the election that will take place in Rome is an all but unique event in Catholic life, apart from elections in religious orders. Election of the Bishop of Rome was always a concern to at least three distinct parties: the local Roman clergy, influential local Roman families, and the Christian Roman emperor. The competition between these parties was intense and sometimes violent. In one such riot involving the election of Pope Damasus, 366 to 384, we know that 137 dead bodies, there you are, dead bodies, were carried out of a church on the site where Santa Maria Maggiore now stands. After the 5th century, Roman emperors resided only in far-off Constantinople, and the nearest imperial representative was the exarch, who was a kind of viceroy, in Ravenna, far to the northeast from Rome. In Ravenna, a long way from Rome. But the popes were still subjects of the Byzantine emperor, as it is customary to call Roman emperors after the imperial line ceased in the West in 476. And for a long time, newly elected popes were not allowed to assume their office until their election had been approved by the emperor in Constantinople. The papacy's liberation from the Byzantine emperor was purchased in the 8th and 9th centuries at the price of recreating the Roman imperial title in the West. Pope Leo III's crowning of the Frankish king Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD may seem to have simply exchanged one royal master far away for another closer to home, but the papacy's initiative changed the political theology involved. Now the popes could claim a certain superiority to the emperor, a stature symbolized by the act of crowning. The precedent eventually took hold that a newly elected emperor had to be crowned and anointed by the pope before beginning to exercise his imperial office. Emperors naturally assumed that their authority outranked the popes, in that they had responsibility for the entire Christian society. Strong emperors usually won that argument, at least until the pontificate of Pope Gregory VII and the investiture conflict of the 11th century. When the Western emperors were weak and the empire in decline, however, local Roman families moved in and captured the papacy for their own purposes. That is the short story behind the unhappy moral low point of the papacy in the 10th century, the one that Cardinal Baronius famously called the saeculum obscurum, the dark century, not just for the unreliability of the sources, but for the moral status of the papacy itself. But what about the clergy? Well, they, of course, were still very much in the picture and still involved in the election of a new pope. When the 11th century popes began to take action to free themselves from the local Roman nobility, they at first depended on the assistance of the Roman emperors, who by this time were German. Between 955 and 1057, there were 25 popes, of whom 12 were straight imperial appointees, the others being creations of the local Roman nobility. 5 popes were deposed or dismissed by the German emperors. Eventually, even the patronage of well-intentioned emperors like Henry III, who died in 1056, came to be seen as intolerable intrusion by laymen into the government of the church. In 1059, a Roman synod led by reformers issued a decree that granted control over future papal elections to the Roman clergy, known as cardinals. That is a word, the earliest instance of which comes from as far back as the 6th century. It applied to deacons, priests, and bishops in Rome, and to the immediate vicinity, who had special roles in the liturgical life and governance of the local church. The 1059 decree was based on a much older ruling from 769. It called for the cardinal bishops to confer together and then to bring in the other cardinal clergy. The rest of the Roman clergy and the Roman people themselves were to assent to the candidate that they had selected. Some special features of this decree were: the election did not have to take place in Rome. The election alone established the candidate in office, not the consecration if it were needed, or a coronation. Full papal powers were enforced immediately. It was now permissible also to translate individuals already consecrated as bishops elsewhere to become pope and bishop in Rome, which was a reversal of the ancient canon law of the church going back to the Council of Nicaea, that bishops were to stay married to the church in which they had been first consecrated. A further change came in 1179 at the Third Council of the Lateran. By this time, the cardinals were acting like a distinct corporate body, a college, that had a share in the government of the church outside of Rome as well. The Third Lateran Council introduced the two-thirds rule. The significance of that change is that it disallowed weighted voting, because it was common practice in other canonical elections to give preference to the pars sanior, the sounder or more judicious part of the community. This being an effort at the Third Lateran Council to equalize the votes and to diffuse the influence of powerful families who had infiltrated the college with their relatives and protégés. If you're keeping track, we still have three interested parties: the clergy who elect, the local Roman nobility, and the Christian emperor. But the picture gets more complicated. Now the electing clergy, the College of Cardinals, are a powerful interest group of their own and tend to act as rivals of each other and of the Pope, rather than as his collaborators. And there isn't just one Christian emperor to deal with, but Christian kings all over Europe who are very keen on controlling the life of the church and in their domains, and therefore interested in who will become pope. The history of the popes up to the Protestant Reformation will be marked by frequent contested elections and schisms in which rival popes will face off against one another, each with his own supporters. Division within the College of Cardinals could produce long periods of vacancy. The nearly 3 years from November 1268 to September 1271, during which the cardinals vacillated in the town of Viterbo and the townspeople took drastic action to force a decision. They tore the roof off the building to get the guys to move. The townspeople took drastic action to force a decision. That created the institution of the Conclave. In 1274, the Second Council of Lyon issued the decree Ubi Maius Periculum, which required that the cardinals assemble within 10 days of a pope's death at the place where he died, that they be deprived of all contact with the outside world, and that they be provided with diminishing resources the longer their decision took. The decree was applied unevenly at first. The election of the hermit Pope Celestine V 20 years later took 2 years. But Celestine reenacted the decree in September 1294 and specified that it would apply also in cases of abdication, which he famously did just 3 months later. Ubi Maius Periculum basically governed papal elections until the Council of Trent. The strains in the medieval papacy reached the breaking point at what is known as the Great Western Schism, which began in 1378 and wasn't resolved until 1417, at which point there were 3 rival popes. This nearly 40-year schism is the greatest constitutional crisis the papacy has ever faced. In previous schisms, contemporaries could usually determine the authentic line of succession. 3 previous schisms in the 12th century, lasting up to 2 decades, were all resolved when support gathered decisively around one contender over against another. That did not happen during the Great Schism. Catholic Europe split more or less down the middle in support of either the Roman line or the Avignon line. Remember that for much of the 14th century, the popes had lived not in Rome, but in papal territory in what is now southern France. Urban VI, an Italian, was elected in Rome in 1378 by a college of cardinals who were mostly French from the previous 70-year Avignon residence. Within 3 months, Urban's policies so alienated the cardinals that they said their election of Urban had been coerced under pressure and that his election was invalid. They withdrew from Rome and elected another pope as Clement VII, who promptly went back to Avignon. On the deaths of each pope, successors were elected. 30 years followed, in which neither line would yield its claim to be the legitimate pope. When a year of negotiations between Benedict XIII, the Avignon pope, and Gregory XII, the Roman pope, failed, cardinals from both camps agreed to hold a council in Pisa in 1409 to end the schism. The Pisa Council excommunicated the 2 current popes and elected Alexander V, only to have him die the following year and be succeeded by John the 23rd. Yes, you heard that number correctly. The Pisa popes succeeded in winning majority but not unanimous support, and when both Benedict XIII and Gregory XII refused to abandon their claims, the Church now had 3 popes. John the 23rd, with the support of the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, convened yet another council in Constance, that's in southern Germany near the Swiss border, in 1414. The council, which adopted the novel method of voting by nations, decided to make a clean sweep of the popes. John at first cooperated and agreed to resign, but he quickly changed his mind, slipped away from Constance, and tried to dissolve the council in order to keep his position. That was the crisis situation which the council, with the Pope absent, in which the council, with the Pope absent, passed the controversial decree Haec Sancta, which affirmed the superiority of the council over the Pope. We can't cover here the dramatic story of how the council finally succeeded in removing all existing claimants and electing Martin V in 1417, for which the conclave rules of cardinals-only voting was relaxed, so that 30 electors from the 5 nations joined 23 cardinals from the 3 papal obediences. Today we recognize that the legitimate papal succession was through the Roman line, which is why the name of John the 23rd was still available in 1958 when Angelo Roncalli was elected pope. But there was enough uncertainty about this that the official papal handbook, the Annuario Pontificio, actually has John the 23rd in the succession, at least in the issues between 1913 and 1940 that I was able to check this afternoon over at Ireland Library. Be that as it may, Martin's election finally ended the schism. The aftermath of the schism occurred when the Council of Basel, 1431 to 1449, went rogue during a tug-of-war with Pope Eugenius IV and elected Felix V in 1439. Felix's renunciation of claims in 1449 marked the end of the era of anti-popes. As fast as it could, the papacy tried to put behind it the crisis of the schism, and in particular, the specter of another council that might threaten the Pope's supremacy in the Church. May I say in parenthesis that a question worth asking is whether the various later attempts that have been made to patch together an ecclesiology that reconciles the Pope's supremacy with the Universal College of the Bishops has really succeeded or not. That kind of depends on how you read chapter 22 and chapter 25 of Lumen Gentium from the Second Vatican Council. And then a second question, whether the College of Cardinals is in fact a better expression of the Church's universality or a competitor with it. And I think at that point I'll stop.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Fagioli?
Thank you. I have divided my remarks in 3 parts. The first part is a very short history of the conclave as an institution in the 20th century. The second part gives a few ideas on what are the key components of this conclave in 2013. And the third part will be what's special about this conclave, especially after the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. So the first fact from which we have to start is that the conclave as an institution, it has changed constantly in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, every pope except Benedict XV has changed slightly the rules of the conclave. Pius the 10th in 1904, after that trauma that in that conclave had excluded one of the top candidates for the veto of the Austrian Empire. In 1917, we have the Code of Canon Law, the first Code of Canon Law, that was very clear in saying that the election of the Pope is a business of the College of Cardinals and not of the Ecumenical Council of the Bishops. In 1945, we have Pius the 12th affirming that the Pope must be elected with a 2/3 majority plus 1, because in the conclave of 1939, the Pope that was elected there, Pius the 12th, had been suspect of having cast a vote for himself. And then we have a special conclave in 1963, which is in the middle of the Second Vatican Council, which makes that conclave special because in a way Pope Paul VI was technically elected by the College of Cardinals, but he was the expression of the Second Vatican Council. That it's one of the most interesting facts of the election. We have an interesting moment of debate in 1969, in the Synod of the Bishops of 1969, when you have a few cardinals and even Pope Paul VI asking if the electoral college of the Pope shouldn't change, maybe, and be open to the president of the national bishop conferences, going back to the nations, nationes, as it was in the 15th century. We have one of the most hated acts of a pope in church history by Paul VI in 1970, when he said that that cardinals older than 80, they cannot elect the pope anymore. So they lose the active vote. I mean, they can be elected, but it's extremely unlikely that they will be elected. We have, in 1975, still Paul VI, establishing a kind of spoil system when the Pope dies. So it's still in force. When the Pope dies in the Roman Curia, everybody automatically resigns, basically. So it's not a pure spoil system, but it's an almost pure spoil system. We have John Paul II in 1996 that had one interesting chapter saying explicitly the Pope can resign, but saying nothing on what happens next, as we have seen in these last 2 weeks. Nobody knows. I mean, day by day, they are coming up with solutions, practical solutions. It establishes that after the Pope's death or resignation, the conclave must begin between 15 and 20 days. And it said also an interesting thing, that the wishable majority is 2/3. But after 15 days that no candidate can get a 2/3 majority, a simple majority is enough. So after 15 days, which is quite unlikely in modern times, but John Paul II was quite worried about that. The major change that Pope Benedict XVI made was that this rule that after 15 days a simple majority is enough has been abolished. And so Pope Benedict wanted his successor to be elected with a 2/3 majority, no matter how long this conclave takes. What is extraordinary about Pope Benedict's pontificate is that he is the only one who has changed the rules for the conclave twice. And what's most remarkable, the second time he did that 72 hours before resigning, which is on Monday. And he said that this rule that the conclave must begin between 15 and 20 days after the vacancy, this time can be shortened if the cardinals agreed on start this conclave after 7 or 8 days or 5 days. So in the 20th century, the conclave has changed several times. What makes this conclave a little different are a few facts in light of what we know that now is a global church, global Catholicism. One thing that Pope Benedict has done is that, and it's not my fault, he has basically re-Italianized the College of Cardinals. Yes. Which is one fact that we have to read in parallel with the fact that he has appointed also many more cardinals who work in the Roman Curia, and they are members of this electoral college. So next week or in 2 weeks, 35% of cardinals that can elect, they are members of the Roman Curia. 52% of the voting age cardinals are European, despite the fact that Europe has only 24% of Catholics. Italy alone has 28 voting cardinals, or 24% of all of them. One reassuring fact is that they are extremely divided. So it's unlikely that we will have an Italian pope. One other thing is that Latin America, which is home to 42% of the world's Catholic population, has only 16% of the cardinals. So you see that Pope John Paul II tried to rebalance this, to appoint more Asian, more African, more Latin Americans. Pope Benedict has re-Europeanized the Roman Curia and the College of Cardinals, and in a way re-Italianized. So this makes this conclave a little more European, but, and this is my third part, I think that this conclave is extraordinary and not just once in a lifetime for a theologian or a church historian like me, but it's once in 1 millennium probably. Why? Because this conclave will be open to new kind of solutions, to possible changes, because Pope Benedict resigned. So we're still trying day by day to take stock of this, to make sense of this. But there are a few facts that for me are incredibly important. The first fact is this, that by resigning, Pope Benedict has decided one thing that has depersonalized the papal office, but he did that in an extremely monarchical way without consulting anybody, which is one of the paradoxes of this situation. So this situation is impacting Catholicism globally. Not to say anything about the poor, Vatican spokesman who really doesn't know what's going to happen hour by hour. But this decision of resigning has been made in total solitude by Pope Benedict. And what we're seeing here is one of the consequences, 50 years after, of the Second Vatican Council, that 50 years ago, Vatican II tried to make the office of the papacy less monarchical, less imperial. And one thing that makes the Pope still, until February 10th, look very similar to a monarch is that what's typical of monarch is not just dynasty or offspring legacy, is that they usually die in office. This is not going to happen for Pope Benedict, and it's quite likely that the conclave gathering next week or in 2 weeks, they will elect somebody expecting that he will resign. Not imposing this, because this cannot be done, but they might elect a younger pope who's 55 or 60, which in the College of Cardinals means young. What Pope Benedict has done is an extraordinary act that has ecclesiological consequences for Catholics and for theologians, but in general, it has a global impact because it is reshaping what can be called the papal mystique, this aura of sacredness, which is going through a radical process of rewording, reshaping, and day by day we learn things, not just as we learned yesterday that he will not wear anymore his red Prada shoes, but other things that are incredibly important. One last thing is this. In less than 24 hours, 8 p.m. Rome time, tomorrow we will have a former pope or a pope emeritus, which fits very well the kind of theologian Pope Benedict is, very monastic. So he will spend the rest of his life, praying in the monastery. I'm not sure what kind of former pope John Paul II would have been. I'm not sure. This is a completely an open question. In some cases, and I'm learning American history here, we have seen in US history that some presidents are much better as former presidents than as sitting presidents. This is what I think might happen to Pope Benedict XVI, and I think that this might cast a new light on what the papacy is, but in general on what being a minister in the Catholic Church is, and in this will go well beyond the boundaries of the Catholic Church. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Massimo. Dr. Schlabach?
Sorry about this, but I think you'll appreciate it. Yep, that's where we're going. Okay. I want to do 4 things as quickly as I can. I want to say a few words on the significance of the Roman papacy for other Christians besides Catholics. I want to call attention to what I call and some other people call the tectonic shift in Christianity southward, to the global south. I'm not one to get into speculating about different papal candidacies, who's who and what, I'll leave that to Massimo if you want to ask him questions. But I do want to give a bit of guidance in terms of what to expect if a pope comes from various continents, especially outside of Europe, based on sort of the emphases that the bishops in those continents seem to have. And then I want to tell you a little why I think that the Roman Catholic Church in America, the best thing for the Catholic Church in America would be not to have an American pope, but a pope from the global south. Quick parenthesis, I used the term global south. Some people would talk about the third world. That's gone somewhat out of favor. Others talk about the two-thirds world. So that's what I'm talking about here. Okay, significance of the Roman papacy for other Christians. It seems to me that the quickest way to just mark such a big topic as, what does the Roman Pope mean to non-Catholic Christians is simply to quickly go through the last 5 popes and mention some of the significant things that they have done that have been important and been noticed and studied and contributed to the life of other churches, not just the Roman Church. John the 23rd, obviously convening the Second Vatican Council, which turned out to be one of the most important, probably the most important events for Christians in the 20th century. Maybe the Holocaust would rival it, but for Christians, all Christians. John the 23rd offering encyclicals such as Pacem in Terris, speaking to worldwide hunger for peace in the context of the Cold War. Paul VI, encyclicals, apostolic letters that were read and studied well beyond the Roman Catholic Church. I think of Evangelii Nuntiandi on evangelization in the modern world, which I'm using in my current class on global Christianity because it provides such a rich source of reflection on how the gospel takes shape in different cultures. I first read that, studied it when I was a Protestant seminarian. John Paul I, papacy of only 33 days, a little hard to know what he would have done, but signaling early on that he wanted to continue the thrust towards ecumenical dialogue, working for the unity of other Christians. I once remember an evangelical Protestant speaker who had been in on some ecumenical dialogues, conversations with him, probably when he was cardinal, and talking about what an impression he made with his sort of warm piety, love of Jesus Christ on these evangelical Protestants. John Paul II, how does one begin? How does one end? He began his papacy with stirring words from Jesus, "Do not be afraid," and in that spirit went on to be a sign of winsome faith in the modern world, even while challenging its more inhumane tendencies. He called 3 different World Day of Prayer for Peace, World Days of Prayer for Peace, bringing together Christian leaders from throughout the Christian world as well as other religious leaders. His Jubilee 2000 words of apology for the actions, the historical failings of Catholic leaders, sealed, in my judgment, the commitment of Vatican II to Catholic participation in Christian peacemaking, ecumenical dialogue, interfaith respect. Benedict XVI, it's perhaps a reflection of his more internally focused papacy, that it's hard to come up with immediately a symbolic act or key statement, but we can remember that evangelical Protestants have taken heart in Benedict's critique of moral relativism, while social justice Protestants have found encouragement in his critique of unbridled capitalism. So the point is, people notice, care, even if they are not Roman Catholic. Okay, from that I want to pivot quickly to my other topic, talking quickly about giving you some maps and so on to illustrate the big story of the 20th century that is often taken for granted or ignored, the shift in global Christianity towards the South. This is a schematic map that I pulled from the Pew Research Center, which did a report in 2010 on the world distribution on global Christianity. Rather dramatic change. We notice in the growth, especially in Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. Relative stability in Europe and North America, despite what people say about the demise of Christianity in the West. Even more relative growth in Latin America, significant growth in Asia, explosive growth in Africa. That's Christians overall, but of course Catholics are 50%, almost exactly, of the global Christian population, according to Pew and others. So we can expect many of these trends, with some regional variations, to follow through with Catholics more specifically. And indeed, when we look at this, we see confirmation. Regional distribution of Catholics, those I should have said comparing 1910 to 2010. Total number of Christians in Europe has in fact risen, although it is in the worldwide percentages much smaller. Significant growth in total numbers in North America, even some relative growth, but compared to sub-Saharan Africa. 100 years ago, less than 1% of Catholics. Now 16%, twice as much as North America. Let me repeat, twice as many Catholics in Africa today as in North America. So if we think it's time for an American Pope, because we are on the cutting edge of 21st century Christianity, I think we should think again. Couple of quick caveats. Raw statistics don't tell us too much about the kind of growth, whether it's population, simply regular population growth, migration, missionary expansion. There would be some important differences between Africa and South America, for example. I think the growth in Africa is likely to be denser in terms of actual participation than Latin America, for example, because you've got first generation, many more first, second generation Catholics, Christians, who are going to probably participate more actively than many, certainly not all, but Latin American Christians, for example, who are sort of more culturally defined as Catholic. And it doesn't say anything, statistics alone don't say anything about the quality of Christian life, the nature of the faith. Christians, of course, have argued for centuries over who's a true Christian. So how do you count them? That would be debatable. Again, a difference in active church-going Catholics versus cultural Catholics. But I think when you see a shift that big in that graphic, even if you could figure out how to control for those, factor in some of those qualitative considerations in terms of what makes for a real Christian life, you would have to, we'd still end up, we might trim the maps here and there, but have to mark a major shift. And even nominal Christians, people who are sort of culturally Christian, kind of at the edge of active participation, still provide or still make a claim to the pastoral responsibilities of the church and its leadership. So as the Cardinals select the Catholic Church's pastor of pastors, the continental shifts, the resulting map, one would think, one would hope, one would expect, ought to be one major consideration. So what to expect if there is a pope from the global south? Here I'm going to rely on a news report from John Allen Jr., National Catholic reporter, Vatican correspondent, his coverage of the Synod of Bishops in last October, I think, where he summarized, of course he listened to many speeches, it's a little bit of his interpretation, but summarized the priorities of the bishops from different continents this way. And my comments are my comments about this, reading his article and so on. But the words I have on the screen are his summary. So from Europe and the States, probably not too surprising for those of us who are participating in life of the Catholic Church in North America, an emphasis from the bishops, different bishops as they made their speeches at the Synod, on sound doctrine, sound sacramental practice as an antidote to the influence of a largely secular culture. Allen highlighted, though, especially Asia, at least the headline reporters highlighted Asia, for a different kind of emphasis on humility, simplicity, and silence. One suspects that some of the reasons are the Asian church is deeply embedded in the interreligious dialogue with Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and their traditions of spirituality, contemplation, devotion. And so the requirements of dialogue in that context are going to float to the surface. They emphasized, though, it's not just a matter of what we need to say in our conversation with Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, one suspects, but that they too have some of the same values of a kind of Christianity that will be contemplative, humble, will witness in the context of dialogue with other religions through lives of integrity, not just arguments, not just theological doctrine. Africa, as Alan summarized it, ministering to people scarred by poverty and violence. One thinks here of how Africa is still coming out of the deep social upheaval of colonialism, rapid nation building, the breakdown of clan and village structures. Warfare, poverty, spread of HIV/AIDS, these things that reach our headlines from Africa are certainly serious in themselves, but are also the continuing legacy of that social upheaval, leaving scarred lives. The other thing from Africa that we might hear from, if we had an African pope, is some apostolic teachings, encyclicals on things like sorcery, witchcraft, and the need for the church to offer liberation from spiritual powers and healing, because these are ways that many Africans find as real options for dealing with their social upheaval, breakdown of relationships. Things that would seem strange as emphases to us, perhaps in North America, although they have deep, ancient Christian roots. Latin America, he highlighted the need to take cues from what's already working, such as popular piety, small Christian communities, what are often called base communities. Many assume that liberation theology is officially in disrepute among the Latin American church leadership, but I think this misunderstands its character and its influence. For one thing, social justice issues haven't gone away. Christians, even Christians on the left identified with liberation theology, my sense is have a more mature sense of how social change is not going to come from easy, sweeping ideological solutions, but from work over the long haul. So that work in the long haul has kind of gone back into more standard Catholic social teaching and continues. But the other thing is that whether people in leadership in Latin America are associated with liberation theology on one hand or the new evangelization on the other hand, a broad swath of bishops and theologians in recent decades have reoriented their pastoral orientation from the elites to the masses. Hence, I think that Alan cites, take our cues from popular Catholic piety, don't disparage it, learn from it, and from what came out of the period of liberation theology in terms of working in base communities. Okay, my last point, and I'm, I think, out of time. So real quickly, this is a PowerPoint from another chapter from John Allen that I used in my class the other week. The take-home points, again, are mine, not his, but I thought they would work here as well. Lessons from John Allen's survey of global Christianity in the chapter, the opening chapter, the first trend in his book on the future church. Forget the subtitle, but take-home points I suggested for my students. Get used to not being in charge or setting the agenda. We North Americans, Europeans also before us, have expected to be in charge. We should probably get used to not being in charge. Secondly, our usual categories and stereotypes are likely to be shattered. This is one thing, and lots of writers about the Christianity of the Global South doesn't line up with our expectations of left, right, liberal, conservative, often as strong on the social conservative issues, sexual morality, and so on, as anyone on the conservative end of the spectrum in the Catholic Church here, but also then very strong in terms of calling for economic justice in the same package, while also taking on some of these issues like witchcraft and sorcery, and because that's important to them. So our different mix. The corollary, we can expect the churches of the global south, when we pay attention to them, to sometimes aggravate us, sometimes encourage us, often at the same time. But learning to be in conversation with that is part of what it means to be in solidarity as Christians, as human beings around the world. So learning that lesson is going to be the best thing for us, I would argue, in the context of our embroiled culture wars in the States, to realize our issues aren't always the ones that matter the most to our brothers and sisters around the world. We have some things to learn from them, beginning with, let's get out of our barricades.
Thank you, Gerald. We have time for questions. We have 2 volunteers who are going to help circulate handheld microphones, and you, the audience, have a chance to ask your questions. As the microphones circulate, I'll acknowledge each person and alternate between microphones so that everyone has a chance to speak. Please.
I was going to ask Massimo about the benefits of an Italian pope who might be a little more flexible on rules than many others would. But I am going to instead ask him about his statement regarding Benedict as being a better retired pope than an active pope, if he could just expand on that a little
bit. For the Pope, the benefit of being Italian is one, he's supposed to know the Roman Curia very well and the Italian political and environment well, which is part of the job of being Pope. I mean, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. So that's the second thing. I don't think that Pope Benedict's pontificate has been a failed pontificate. I don't think that. I do think that there are many issues that he inherited from John Paul II, and so Pope Benedict's pontificate has to be read and understood as one thing with John Paul II, under whom he served as chief theologian for 25 years. But there are issues that have become divisive in Catholicism, and they are issues that, frankly, Pope Benedict owns. Like the debate on the liturgical counter-reform. This is, frankly, one issue that we didn't have before him. And so this is, I think that he discovered fairly quickly that the job of Pope was much more overwhelming than he expected. And in this, I really believe that he didn't want, on April 19, 2005, to become Pope, but I mean, back then, he was the only candidate, really the only real candidate. So he has served with humility. It's a pontificate that has been extremely complicated on many issues, Jews, Islam. It's not been smooth at all.
We have a question down in front.
Dr. Schlaubasch, how likely do you think it is that we'll get a Southern Pope?
I've just tried not to play the game of speculating, because I think what's most likely to happen is that we'll be surprised. Now, And besides, I can always go down the hall and ask Massimo, so I'll do that now.
We have a question in the back.
Dr. Hollick, I was wondering, since we studied Vatican II in your last class, is there a possibility that there will be a Vatican III with the election of a new pope?
Normally I would say historians are much better about talking about the past than the future, but on this one, I don't think it's going out on much of a limb to say this is not going to happen. We will. The modern papacy doesn't like councils. In fact, popes have never really liked councils that they couldn't control. And if you're counting, since the Protestant Reformation, we've had exactly 3. This will not happen soon. We're still absorbing the achievements of the last one, and my colleague here, next door to me here, has made his second field the reception of the Second Vatican Council's first one was the reception of the Council of Trent. Popes, I repeat, do not like councils. They avoid them the way that medieval kings avoided estates general. And we know what happened when the French king Louis XVI got cornered into calling the Estates General in 1789.
Question over here.
I'll throw this out to the whole panel. The movie The Shoes of the Fisherman, is the presentation of the ritual of the conclave an accurate portrayal of what occurs? And has it changed in the 20th century? And then I have a second question, excuse me, and that is, will Benedict allow himself to be an elector? So, those two.
If you could repeat your first question, because I'm not sure if I understand.
Are you familiar with the movie The Shoes of the Fisherman? The 1960s movie about the election of a...
Okay. So I'm not...
This is the first time we've ever seen Massimo stumped.
Yeah. So on the second part of your question, he made clear that he will not take part in the conclave, and this is the beginning of a very delicate and unexplored relationship. So, for example, in one strange thing, he has decided that he will live in this convent in the Vatican City, assuming that his successor will like the idea. And we don't know. I mean, one big question that many people have is how. So, will former Pope Benedict have an influence on his successor? I think so, in some way, in a subtle, invisible way. But by saying during the conclave, I'm going to be in Castel Gandolfo, a few miles from Rome, he wants to send this signal that he's not part of the Electoral College and that he doesn't want to be reelected. Well, yeah. Of course, he has appointed a great number of the electors. So his influence will be palpable, for sure. For the first part, I believe.
I actually wanted to comment on that first question with attribution to a former colleague, Sean Hughes, because I once asked him that same question about the ritual in the movie version of Morris West's novel, The Shoes of the Fisherman. If you haven't seen the film, it's still worth watching, if only for the privilege of seeing Anthony Quinn on the Sedia Gestatoria. And his answer to the question was that, in fact, yes, the the representation of the ritual attached to the conclave was in fact pretty faithful. So if I'm wrong, you can send an email to Sean Hughes back in Ireland.
We have a question in the center here.
Are there any candidates on the radar already? Are there rules as to how many there can be, and how are they chosen?
Okay, so there are many candidates. So according to the Code of Canon Law, any male baptized who can be ordained bishop is eligible. So, but usually the college chooses one among them. There are many candidates. I mean, some of these cardinals, they think that they're candidates, and they're not. And some others, they don't think are candidates, and they are. So one of the major changes after John Paul II is that until John Paul II, we had three possible ways to elect a pope: with a ballot, I mean casting ballots, per inspiration. So in terms of an act of the Holy Spirit that is recognized by the whole college, and per compromise. So if after a number of votes there's no majority, the whole college appoints a group who comes out with one name. And Pope John Paul II says, we want only an election with ballots. This is important because the conclave is an extremely democratic moment in the history of, in the life of the Catholic Church, and quite differently, for example, from the UN, nobody has a veto power. And so one cardinal from New York or from Ghana has one vote. It's very egalitarian. So it's a democratic process. Everybody can be elected, male baptized, but usually they elect one of them, and they don't choose one of the cardinals older than 80 years old that cannot take part in the election. So one thing, the last thing that's important is that one of the things that that cardinals cannot do is to campaign. It's explicitly stated in the Code of Canon Law, and there's a penalty of excommunication if you influence externally the election with bribe, money, promises. That's one legacy of the Middle Ages. But in modern times, when the pressure of modern media is so high, especially after the clerical abuse scandal and so on, these rules have a different taste. And so these external pressures are now extremely difficult to manage, and that's why usually you have a very short conclave, 2 days, 3 days, which is not natural. It's unnatural, but they are very afraid that after the third day, CNN will say breaking headlines, Catholic Church on schism, because after 3 days they cannot come up with a candidate. So that's a very strong pressure.
Historical footnote, the last time someone was elected who was not in the College of Cardinals at the time of his election was none other than Urban VI, whose election ended up triggering the Great Schism. I didn't mention that his cardinals, who 3 months later decided that he was not the pope that they thought they had elected, was brutal in his treatment of them, 1 year executing 5 of them, which precipitated another series of secessions from the cardinals who went over from the Roman side to the French side. So it's not the happiest of precedents for going outside of the chosen body.
Please.
I have a question. You talked about electing a pope that's fairly young, in like 60s, 50s. Now, but the reason for that would be that he shows humility? Because you also said that he would be expected to resign, just like Pope Benedict. So is that what they're looking for someone that does not want the spot, does not want to be elected Pope? Is that what you meant by it? Or I would just like you to clarify or expand on that.
One essential part of the papal mystique is that during the conclave, you shouldn't show that you want it. It was part of the rule of the good Pope called the Papa repugnant, means I'm not worthy of it. So if you really want to elect me, I'm going to do this, but I don't think that I'm worthy of it. Okay? And 1 second after to grab the whole thing. Okay? So that's part of the rule of conduct. Okay? And so humility has always been part officially of the job. Now, with this precedent of the resignation, it's not sure that they will elect a young pope counting on the fact that at 75 or 80 or 85 he will resign. But it will be part of the conversation when they talk about who's going to be the next pope. So in 1958, they elected John the 23rd, who was 77, because he was supposed to die soon. They wanted a very short pontificate. And it was short, but it was very, very important. But age is a crucial part of this. When they elected John Paul II in 1978, he was 58 because, which is very young, because the previous pope had been pope for 33 days. And so they chose not one who was, famous, but also young, healthy, athletic, energetic. So they wanted, I don't think that they had him, under a physical examination, but almost. They wanted to be very sure that it could last. Okay, so that's always been part of it. Now it's more complicated because with the resignation, modern medicine makes miracles, but resignation is one thing that can be part of the next pope or cannot. It's up to him.
In the back, please.
Thank you. Dr. Maximum, do you think that all the speculation that may bring the election of a pope from the global south may bring division in the church?
I think that the divisiveness in the church comes from other factors. So usually we tend to judge these candidates or this pope according to ideological lines, liberal, conservative, or in terms of geographical lines. In this, for example, John Paul II was a very European pope. But what he did in terms of shaping a global awareness of Catholicism has been unprecedented. He came from Poland. Poland was known for, in some quarters of his Catholicism, for his anti-Semitism. And he has done things with Judaism that were unthinkable, simply. And so expectations are always changed, especially the conclave is a very magical moment because it has to create a monarch that doesn't have a dynasty. That's the magic of that system, and in that magic, expectations are always different from what we see, and many times from what even the electors have. They are usually, disappointed or surprised by the guy they elected.
Please.
What was the rationale behind Paul VI's decision to cap the electoral age at 80? Was that to just control the number of electing cardinals?
No, it was to make quicker the turnover. In layman terms, he wanted to get rid of all conservatives. That's why they hated so much for him for that. One thing that it has created is one big problem is that now in the Catholic Church now we have 117 cardinals younger than 80 and 86 cardinals older than 80, which is a completely unbalanced because if you have a 2/3 pope elected by the 115 is a minority in the whole college of cardinals older and younger than 80. And a good canon lawyer, I hope there's no canon lawyer here, but a good canon lawyer might make an argument this election is invalid because more than 2/3 of the cardinals did not vote for him, younger or older than 80. So this rule is one of the most controversial. Also because, theologically, there's no reason. What makes of you a good candidate at 79 and 364 days and not a good candidate, good pope 1 day later? So it was purely functional to have a group of the conservative cardinals at the Second Vatican Council out of the game. This is how the Holy Spirit works.
We have two questions up front, maybe first row first and second row second.
If I understood you correctly, it sounds like Pope Benedict has the opportunity to define his own retirement.
He has done.
So does that mean that so if he were to choose to write in his retirement and publish papers and books in his retirement, he can choose to do that? There's no one who will give him any direction?
Well, the next pope could cut power from the convent where he stays. Or this is a very important question because we know, for example, that he was working at his last encyclical. They found out that it will not be ready, this encyclical, by tomorrow. And so they said this will be published as personal reflections of the former Pope, of the Pope Emeritus. That creates a completely new genre in the theological literature, which happened already under him when he published these books on Jesus, these 3 books. But there he told explicitly, these are my personal thoughts, they are not magisterium. But with a former pope, publishing a text that was supposed to be an encyclical, I don't think that it's likely to have a schism. But we have a kind of gray area in what's magisterium and what's not magisterium. So in this, I'm very sure, and I really hope, that the next pope will make his feelings clear about the boundaries of what former Pope Benedict can do, because one of the things that the Pope does is to manifest the unity of the Church. We have no precedent for this. The only thing that is comparable is what happened after 1970, when even diocesan bishops, they had to resign at 75. And that has created a lot of tensions, but locally. So it's my problem, it's your problem, it's not the whole church problem. This, we don't know what is going to happen. So we know that the writings of Pope Benedict are a big operation. So there's a foundation, they are translated in 15 languages, they are sold in millions of copies, so it's unlikely that he will stop completely. But in terms of publicity, in terms of who will publish that, I mean, not Vatican Library probably, somebody else, many surprises we'll see, I think.
Do you think there will be a change because of his status now as not the head of a state, that there would be civil process that could be served upon him if he left the Vatican, that he would be subject to deposition for the things that he learned within the church, because he no longer would be the sovereign and therefore could be subject to jurisdiction outside of the Vatican?
I heard this. So when they tried to accuse him of something that he did when he was Archbishop of Munich, they found nothing. The other case that some lawyers, especially from Minnesota, I mean, tried to do is to make this case that being the Catholic Church firm, the CEO of this firm is responsible for what any priest does. I don't think this is a factor. So the personality of Pope Benedict is extremely shy. So I know that he didn't consider going back to Germany because it would have made of his birth, his place of birth, Vatican II in terms of place, not council. A Catholic Disneyland, I mean, something like that. And he didn't want that. So I don't think that he's afraid of that. I really don't think that. All that said, it's clear that the clerical scandal is a cloud on this conclave, and it will play a role. And this, the thing that has shocked the most this Pope, in terms of his personality, of his perception of sin in the church. His famous speech of 2005. So he has been personally haunted by this. But I think that he has bigger fears than lawyers. I don't think that. It's my opinion.
Please.
I'm curious. Do you know if Hans Kung has made any statement or any indication of what he thinks regarding the resignation?
Hans Kung always makes statements. So
but I've searched and Googled and did all I could, and I haven't found one yet.
He made a statement yesterday or today. I'm working between two time zones, so I don't remember. But he basically said that this act doesn't change anything because it's still a monarchical act that has been taken completely personally by the Pope. Is still being Hans Kung. So it's one remarkable thing is that they met as soon as Pope Benedict was elected as two German theologians, but their views have not been reconciled at all, at all.
Thank you.
We have a question up front on the right. Oh, there's another one in the center first. Okay.
So my question is related to the Second Vatican Council in a way. I was wondering to what extent we should see Pope Benedict as kind of being the last pope of the Vatican II era, so to speak, and how we should see that. I guess this would be more directed towards Dr. Schlabach. If we get a pope from what you call the global south, if that would be almost an entirely new direction from the church in the overall kind of historical scheme of things.
Well, it depends a little bit. I mean, how you interpret what it means to be a Vatican II pope. Obviously, the people who were, the men who were present are moving off the scene, and so on. On the other hand, there's a very influential piece by Karl Rahner towards a fundamental interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, where he argued that the Second Vatican Council is only the second big shift in the church since Jesus, opening up a third era that in which the church finally becomes a world church. He said, you know, the Protestant Reformation, as important as that is to so many people, and you know, it often marks the change of an era in church history, that's going to, in the long run, pale in comparison to Vatican II. The first shift happened only a few years after Jesus, when Jewish Christianity became Gentile Christianity. And always with the possibility, the potentiality of becoming world Christianity, opening up an era of a truly transcultural church spread around the world, but only with Vatican II has it happened, has it begun to happen. And that's what he meant by a fundamental reading, you know, at the deepest level, what's going on in Vatican II. So in that sense, in that second sense, non-chronological sense, you know, if Rahner's right, and of course it's such a big argument, it's hard to prove it or disprove it, but if he was right, then in fact we're going to have a lot more Vatican II popes before we really even figure out what it means to be a world church.
There's
I don't know if that answered your question.
Just quickly, I've really enjoyed hearing all about the demographics, the politics, the rule changing, the stacking the court. I mean, this has been very, very enlightening, and I appreciate it from you gentlemen. But I'd also like to hear from the three of you, how much influence do you think the Holy Spirit will have on this process?
To be a practicing Catholic is to trust that the Holy Spirit is at work, even amidst the messy politics of the institutions. So, I mean, we have to hope and believe that it will be the leading of the Holy Spirit.
My German mentor told me always a wonderful sentence. He said, Gnade ereignet sich im Kämpfen, which means grace happens while you fight. And so I think that it plays a fundamental role. I think that we should be prepared to understand in human terms what are the factors. I don't see them as one against the other.
You're not going to like my answer. Lord Acton is supposed to have said that the Catholic historian has the highest ideals but the lowest expectations. The Spirit blows where it will, as Jesus himself says in the Gospel of John. So I have no anticipation at all of what concretely the Spirit may bring. I think that, frankly, as a constitutional skeptic, I would prefer to see the evidence of the Spirit's work in the past to assess where we've been and where we might have gone otherwise. I raised a question about the College of Cardinals versus the Universal College of the Bishops as a curious kind of bicameral legislature that we developed that only emerged slowly over hundreds of years. I guess that was the work of the Spirit.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, I recall back in the 1960s when television became the dominant medium, I heard someone say with their tongue probably slightly in their cheek, well, no more old fat Italian popes. To what degree, if any, will the cardinals consider image, television abilities, linguistic skills, or does the Holy Spirit concern that too?
Well, if being a media person is a requirement for the job, I mean, they would have never elected Joseph Ratzinger. He's the anti-show, anti-media person. So, and that has been a problem for him. So it is part of it. I mean, Rome, the Vatican, is, in my view, the last great theater of the sacred in the Western world. Even if you don't believe, if you're not Catholic, not Christian, you perceive that there's something there that it tells you something. And perform is important there. So it's part of it. What's completely new in church history is not quite the fact that you have to perform, but it is that you have to be visible. I mean, the very fact, and this is one thing that Pope Benedict in his last speech said this morning as one of the unbearable burden for him to have lost completely privacy, which is remarkable. I mean, coming from a pope, he said, when you become pope, you lose every privacy you have. And not just in the theological terms, but in practical terms. So this is very much part of it. The linguistic skills are very important, but not to be a pope, but to become pope. If you don't speak English well, if you don't speak Spanish well, your chances of being elected pope are not very good. It's part of it. And I think it makes sense in light of that it's a global church. So you have to be able to show some knowledge or of concepts that can be expressed only in English or only in Spanish. So that is part of it. In this sense, the Italians have lost the papacy forever, and Italians now are just one of the many nations. I think that. I don't think that now a big question is, let's go back to an Italian pope. That's my impression.
The British Anglican Church historian Owen Chadwick, whom I greatly admire and is one of the best historians of the modern papacy post-Reformation, said about Roman Catholicism that part of its genius is that it is structured so that a person is its public face in a world run by too often faceless organizations. And he thinks that's part of its enduring gift. Visibility makes that personal face even more important. That's a great question.
Well, thank you for coming this evening, and please join me in thanking our panelists for their time.